What were the Mastodons? Who were the first explorers of the Americas? And how does the Ice Age fit into the biblical framework of ancient history? Join Zachary Klein and the Missouri Association for Creation as they explore these topics at the Mastodon State Historical Site.
Mastodon State Historic Site, about 25 miles south of St. Louis, marks one of Missouri's most important paleontological and archaeological sites for understanding the Ice Age and early human history in North America. Established in 1976, work at this site has actually continued since the mid-19th century. In this video, we're going to give you a short tour of this historic site and connect some of the discoveries that were made here with the biblical history and account of Noah's flood and the Tower of Babel. Mastodon State Historic Site, about 25 miles south of St. Louis, marks one of Missouri's most important archaeological and paleontological sites for understanding the Ice Age and early human history in North America. While the park here was founded in 1987, scientific work at the site has continued since the early 1900s, with some surprises along the way. In this video, we're going to give you a short tour of this historic site and connect some of the findings that were made here with the Bible's account of early Earth and human history. The discoveries here at Mastodon State Historic Site go back to 1839, when Albert Koch, a local exhibitor and fair owner, heard reports of large mammal bones being dug up from the banks of the river not too far from this location. When Albert Koch arrived and began excavating these bones, he realized quickly that they were from a large prehistoric animal. However, not being a paleontologist or a biologist, he did not realize what animal he was excavating. Over the course of a year, Albert Koch excavated at least 2 American mastodons, a ground sloth, and other Ice Age animals. He then assembled these bones to create an animal that he named the Missouri Leviathan. Now, the Missouri Leviathan, of course, is not a real creature. It was about twice the size of an American mastodon, the actual skeleton that Albert Koch was digging up. Albert Koch also developed some interesting history for this animal. He proposed that it hung from floating logs in the river by tilting its head up and hanging from its tusks. Additionally, he said that it was killed by an asteroid impact, because why not? In 1844, Albert Koch took his show on the road and ended up in London, where he exhibited the Missouri Leviathan to crowds of fans. Sir Richard Owen of the British Museum, most famous for coining the term dinosaur, observed the exhibition and realized what was going on. Sir Richard Owen purchased the skeleton from Albert Koch, reassembled it, and put it on display where it is today in the British Museum as the Kimmswick Mastodon, a beautiful specimen of the American mastodon that lived in this continent during the Ice Age. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, paleontological work continued here at this site. Additional bones were discovered, as well as some important archaeological discoveries that would link the American mastodon with early human history. Finally, in 1987, the state park was established to protect the site as the construction of Interstate 55 developed nearby. So what exactly is a mastodon? Mastodons are often confused with their relative, the woolly mammoth. In fact, mammoths are actually larger than mastodons and had a very different diet. Mastodons tended to graze on shrubs and trees, tree branches. Woolly mammoths then are more associated with the grasslands of ancient Siberia. At the visitor center here at the historic site, mastodons, mammoths, Asian and African elephants, and other extinct members of the Proboscideae family are assembled together into what's called an evolutionary tree, with a common ancestor from which all the various subspecies of Proboscideae animals descended. How do we look at this as biblical creationists? So creationists have developed a new taxonomic term, the beramin, taken from the Hebrew word bera for create and min for kind. A beramin, or a created kind, represents the original created type of animal that God created in the beginning.
What baraminologists do is that they seek to apply a range of different criteria, from hybridization studies to statistical analyses based on the morphology, the overall shape and form of living creatures, to try to identify continuity, evidence of continuity between different species. And in most cases, at least among the vertebrates, which is probably where we've done most work, the created kind seems to be roughly equivalent to what we would call the family in the standard Linnaean taxonomy. So people may be familiar with the standard taxonomic hierarchy. So we have species. Species are then grouped together into genera. Genera are grouped together into families, families into orders, orders into classes, and so on. Now, in the case of the elephants, and I'm using that term in the broadest sense, we're actually dealing with an entire order. So not a family, but an entire order called the Proboscidea. And within the Proboscidea, we actually have multiple families of elephants. The Ice Age mammoths, now they're interesting because they actually were members of the Elephantidae. So they are, in effect, members of the same family as the living elephants. So they are almost certainly members of the same created kind. And that kind would have been represented on the ark. And when that group of elephants came off the ark, they diversified into the different species of elephants that we have today, and also the mammoths. So that's one of those families. The mastodons, however, actually belong to a different family. They're a separate family. They may look superficially similar in some respects to the mammoths, but the mastodons actually have some differences to mammoths. They're shorter, they're stockier, they have shorter, straighter tusks. They were more adapted for browsing, whereas the mammoths were grazers. They were sort of living on grasslands. So there are some differences. And so they appear to be, in fact, a separate created kind to the mammoths.
So what was the Ice Age? Conventionally, there are believed to have been as many as 50 periods of glaciation, or ice ages. In these periods, ice is said to have accumulated in the northern parts of the continents and then advanced southward, covering much of North America, Europe, and Asia. Now, the most of the direct evidence for an ice age is only of the most recent period of glaciation, which is again conventionally believed to have been about 100,000 to 30,000 years ago. How do we square this with the Bible's time frame? Well, of course, creationists would not accept the absolute ages for the Ice Age and would generally propose that there was only ever that one last Ice Age, as opposed to there being 40 or 50. But the conditions for an Ice Age are rather contradictory. To develop an Ice Age, you need to have more precipitation, more rain, and therefore more snowfall. To get that, you need more evaporation, more water from the oceans entering the atmosphere to condense and fall as rain and snow. However, in addition to warm conditions for evaporation, to get an ice age, you need cold conditions over the continents. What could both cool the land and warm the sea? This contradiction has hampered attempts to explain the Ice Age in terms of purely naturalistic phenomenon. However, the biblical flood offers a potential key to this otherwise puzzling dilemma. You see, in Genesis 7, chapter 11, we read that at the beginning of the flood, the fountains of the great deep were broken apart. Creation scientists believe that this is referring to a volcanic and tectonic event occurring in the oceans, and therefore producing large quantities of heat, of volcanism, of magma, and other volcanic phenomenon starting in the oceans.
The Ice Age climate had mild winters, but cool summers. And the reason for that, on land, you would cool the summers by all the residual volcanic ash and aerosols and meteorite impact debris left in the stratosphere. And it affects mainly the summers. It wouldn't affect the winters at all.
This cooling effect due to volcanism has been known to happen even in modern times. Volcanic eruptions often lead to a drop in global temperature. Worldwide volcanic activity at the time of the flood could lead to worldwide continental cooling immediately after the flood, while the ocean waters would still retain their excess heat from that same volcanism.
The warmer the sea surface temperatures, the more the evaporation. During the Ice Age, it could have been, say, 25 to 30 degrees centigrade, 30 degrees centigrade being 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and you can give off huge amount of water vapor at mid and high latitudes from the oceans. Mild winters and cool summers with little seasonal contrast. That's the climate that results in rapid deposition of snow at the high latitudes and in some places in the mid latitudes and in the mountains, starting with the high mountains and then lowering with time. Even tropical mountains were glaciated about 3,000 feet lower than the glacial line today. So timing the cooling of the ocean, 3/4 by evaporation, 1/4 by contact of cooler air from land blowing over the warmer water. The water will warm the air, but that air will cool the top of the ocean. And so you can time it based on estimates of what the paleoclimate was like during the Ice Age. And so based on that timing, I estimated that the Ice Age was approximately 500 years to reach glacial maximum. And then it took about 200 years to melt after that.
Here, at the end of the Wildflower Trail, we see this concrete pad that marks one of the dig sites where the bones of American mastodons and other Ice Age animals were uncovered. These dig sites stretch along the Wildflower Trail, usually marked by either concrete or some other disturbed earth. When scientific research ended in this location, the bone bed was buried to protect it from vandalism and from theft, and to preserve it for future excavation if funding and interest develops. Now, the bones here at Mastodon State Historic Site are conventionally dated to be anywhere from 12 to 15,000 years old. The Ice Age is believed to have taken place between 100 to 30,000 years ago. These dates are generally derived using radiocarbon or carbon-14 dating. Well, speaking of radiocarbon specifically, these sorts of dates require a calibration, a correlation between the amount and kind of carbon in the atmosphere with the amount of carbon you find in a given bone. Knowing that correlation is very important to getting an accurate date, which is why radiocarbon dates are very accurate in recent history, where we have direct data for how much carbon is currently in the atmosphere or how much carbon was in the atmosphere 100 years ago. As you go farther back in time, however, we do not have that kind of data. And if you do not have an accurately calibrated radiocarbon curve representing the carbon in the atmosphere, your date is going to be progressively inflated as you go back in time.
Carbon-14 is produced in the upper atmosphere of the Earth. When cosmic rays, which are continually bombarding the upper atmosphere, they produce subatomic particles called neutrons. And these neutrons collide with atoms of nitrogen-14, which is a very abundant gas in the atmosphere. And the nitrogen-14 gets converted to carbon-14. After it forms, carbon-14 then decays back into nitrogen-14. The neutron breaks down into a proton and an electron, and the electron is ejected. It's a process called beta decay. And we know that this process happens in such a way that it has a half-life of 5,730 years. We can basically use this process as a dating method to date how old organic samples such as fossil bones are or fossil shells are. If the carbon-14 has formed at a constant rate in the Earth's atmosphere for a very long time. But notice that we've made some important assumptions, right? We've assumed that the production rate of carbon-14 has always been the same in the Earth's past as it is today. And we've also assumed that the biosphere has the same proportion of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the past as we measure today. And in fact, these assumptions are very questionable, certainly in the creation model. So in the creation model, for example, we think there's very good reason to understand that the Earth's magnetic field has been progressively getting weaker over time. So in the past, it was much stronger. And the reason this is important is because a stronger magnetic field would basically have shielded the Earth more effectively from the cosmic rays that are producing carbon-14 in the atmosphere. And so, in effect, the biosphere would have had a lower carbon-14 concentration in the past, if that were the case. Also, of course, in the creation model, we have to take into account the worldwide flood in the days of Noah. During the flood, a huge amount of carbon from the pre-flood biosphere was destroyed, was buried. And we find it today in the rock record as coal and oil and gas and limestones and other fossil materials. So a huge amount of carbon was actually removed from the biosphere and buried at the time of the flood.
While you can only date organic remains, not rocks, coal is an excellent sample to date through radiocarbon. However, the coal layers in the rock record have a peculiar characteristic in that no matter what their supposed age, be it 300 million years to 100 million years, coal seams in Missouri and elsewhere in the Midwest all date to roughly 35 to 40,000 years, according to conventional radiocarbon. Now, this is significant because it means that all of the rock record's coal seams represent plants that, according to radiocarbon, lived at the same time.
Now, both of those things, the stronger magnetic field and the burial of all of this organic carbon at the time of the flood, both have the same effect, which is to, in effect, give erroneously old ages for fossil samples, given the assumption that the carbon-14, carbon-12 proportion has always been the same and the production rate has always been the same. Bearing in mind what we know about the Earth's past and these facts of a stronger magnetic field, the burial of all of this organic carbon at the time of the flood, we need to devise a way that then allows us to recalibrate the radiocarbon dates. And it will mean that those dates actually are much younger than they appear to be in the old Earth model.
So the settlement of North and South America are pretty much understood to be the last events in this early human history. So it's about 6,600 miles from where the Tower of Babel probably took place in the land between the rivers, Mesopotamia, until you get to Western Alaska, walking across the Bering Land Bridge. And that's just the gateway to the Americas, right? That's just the start. So just to get to the door, 6,600 miles. Now, people who do long through hikes on the Appalachian Trail, they typically want to do between 10 and 15 miles a day. If you're really trying to hurry, you might want to do it 20 miles a day. That is a lot of hiking. That is hard going. And so going at that rate, assuming that you could go at that rate, it would take you about a year and a half-ish to go from Mesopotamia to Western Alaska simply by hike. Now, people in those days could not have done that, of course, because they don't have grocery stores and supply chains and so forth. They had to get their own food, they had to get their own supplies, so it would have taken them longer. And I don't imagine the post-flood period and the post-flood people dispersing like that. I imagine that they're going to be moving along in ways that make some sense, right? So they're going to move in a way that is more like a dispersal, which is you settle down in a place for a while and then maybe you pick up and you move on, or maybe your kids move on farther. So it would have taken, let's just assume best case scenario that they knew where they wanted to go and they were on their track to get there. It still would have, I think, taken them decades to be able to gather the supplies in order to make the journey. This was not a trivial journey. And I don't think that's how it happened. I think it took considerably longer than that, probably a century or two at least, just to make that movement.
In addition to the mastodon bones and other animal bones that were uncovered at this location, scientists also discovered spear points, or Clovis points as they're called, for Clovis, New Mexico, where they were first discovered. These spear points indicate that the animals buried here were actually hunted and likely butchered at this location. The spear points, or Clovis points as they're called, from Clovis, New Mexico, were found here together with mastodon bones, and in some cases in contact with mastodon bones, confirming that this was a hunting location and not simply a random coincidence. These Clovis points were commonly formed from chert, which is a hard rock that fractures and makes a nice sharp tip. So very useful for tool formation and for making weapons such as these spearheads and arrowheads. Now, there's very little known about the Clovis culture. There are no campsites. There's very little archaeological evidence of them. They appear to have had short-lived campsites and probably moved fairly frequently. Now, this is interesting when we think about biblical history. According to the Bible, the human population was reduced to a single family at the flood of Noah's day. Noah and his sons then multiplied and spread throughout the earth over the ensuing centuries.
Among conventional anthropologies, who believe that the Americas were settled more than 10,000 years ago over a process that took probably thousands of years, they would say there's basically two possible routes to get into North America from the Alaska area. And one route would be overland, and that would require the melting of the ice sheets and forming of a corridor down into the interior of North America. And the other possibility is they came down the coast. The interior route is usually the one you hear about, but there are always those guys sort of off to the side going, they could have come down the coast. I tend to think they would have come down the coast. The coastline makes a lot of sense to me. You can find rivers providing you with fresh water. There's plenty to eat. The sea provides lots of good stuff to eat. And other resources, skins for clothing and shelter and so forth. So it would make sense to me that the people would predominantly be moving down the coast, perhaps, and only later coming down through the land corridor.
What we do see is a pattern of rapid human expansion, exploration, migration, and invasion. This is consistent with the biblical account of the dispersion at the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, when God judged post-flood humanity by confusing their languages, causing them to scatter and spread to the farthest reaches of the post-flood world.
The model that I have presented can account for a rapid ice age of 700 years total. The flood produced the conditions that caused the climate change after the flood. And therefore the flood was a real event. There's lots of evidence for the flood out there. With the flood being real, that indicates that Genesis 1 to 11 is real. The history of Genesis 1 to 11 is real. And this also indicates that the whole Bible can be trusted. The history can be trusted, and the spiritual concepts that it teaches can be trusted.
In 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter speaks of the world that was, the world that then was, being overflowed with water and perishing. The Bible's account of the flood is of a global reshaping of the earth, wiping out both man and animals and giving the earth a fresh start.
For me, the reality of the flood, understanding that the flood is a real event. It's not just a children's storybook, fairy tale. It's not a myth. It's reality, and we can actually go out and see evidence of the flood in the world around us, in the rocks and in the fossils. That, to me, is immensely powerful because it confronts us with the reality of our own sin and our own need of salvation in Christ. And so for me, that's the most important message of the flood, I guess, for all of us and for the world in which we live, that we need to flee to Christ for salvation, just as Noah found refuge in the ark.
This concludes our tour of Mastodon State Site. The information found in the Visitor Center and the discoveries made here at this location are fascinating. But most importantly, they tell a story of an earth that's been reshaped, and of animals and humans reestablishing themselves amidst a changing environment and a devastated planet in the aftermath of God's judgment at the time of the flood of Noah.
I study God's creation in part because I have a lot of questions. I watch, Nova specials, I read National Geographic, I look at scientific journals and so forth, and I see a story of the origin of humanity that's very different from what I read in the Bible. And, it makes me wonder, well, how does this fit together? I keep finding that if you view the data of science in a certain way, and if you view the scriptures in the correct way, they fit together like puzzle pieces. It's amazing. And it keeps happening. This isn't just one time. This is over and over again. It makes me think that I'm on the right track. It encourages my faith. It makes me excited to think about what discoveries are we going to make next. So for me, that's what really motivates me in this. It's the thrill of discovering things about God and his creation and being affirmed and encouraged in my walk with Jesus.